Turn on.
Cause the wicked man to see how the
Tune in.
The Satanist, the black magician, is not seeking that kind of
Well, no, I think we're very control. If you keep the calculations, more or less, you can calculate.
One thing that I had 4 years on to become intelligent.
Dr. Hans Utter, welcome back to the Gnostic Media Podcast. Good to have you back.
It's wonderful to be back, Jan. It's been quite a while.
Well, you've been on, I guess, more than any other guest, except for maybe Joe Atwill, but it's good to have you back. We're starting a new series today, a short one, a two-parter. What's the title of this one?
Laying the Dead to Rest.
And what a wonderful, fitting title. And is this going to be, by chance, about, will it have anything to do with the Grateful Dead?
Perhaps. Yeah, I think so.
All right. So, well, where do you want to dive in, Hans?
Yeah, well, I'll just read the call for this interview. Is for part one is called Occult Networks and the Holosonic Control Matrix, which I kind of talked about in the beginning. And the impetus for this was something that I witnessed as I was traveling around the country, which probably by the time this airs is probably considered passé, but it was the Pokemon Go phenomena. And I went in various cities and I saw just groups of people moving around like zombies, staring at their cell phones with no social interaction. And I didn't know about Pokemon Go. I wasn't following the news at that time. And I was like, have I just stepped into the science fiction universe? I thought of the show The Prisoner or something. It was just bizarre. I mean, and then when I, discovered Pokemon Go and gave it a go myself, what surprised me was it connected with kind of the tail end of our FM radio series, some stuff that I had touched on, which I viewed as kind of more the speculative end of something that may come about in 10 or 20 years, which relates to this whole idea of, well, we'll get into it later, but mapping and modeling consciousness, of actually transforming our entire perceptions, even our inner states, into something that becomes managed, mediated, and manipulated.
Sure, the 2045 Avatar project, I think, is what you're talking about.
Yeah, well, there's all kinds of other, various things, algorithmic, predictive mechanisms, all these other things. And this is, huge, massive project. But the interesting thing is, it all comes back to the Grateful Dead. And I had actually wanted to go into and do a case study about the Grateful Dead. But I think with this first part, I'm going to lay some of the basis of my argument, because I would assume it sounds a bit far out. Maybe not groovy. In fact, Jerry, the curse of Jerry, he's going to come from the grave. Yeah, that would be scary, man. But
all coked out and.
But so and there's a lot of, when I did this, I came across a lot of interesting material. So I would just say, let's go ahead and dive in here. And I think that I will make the point by kind of presenting the case of all the different players in the cast of characters in their own words, with their own backgrounds and their associations. And one thing to note is there is currently a new rollout, to a certain extent, of psychedelics. There's interest in LSD therapy. There's a lot of new papers being done about shamanism, psychedelic drugs, and in fact, talking about the neurological state, which is kind of a state of chaos, which is they're positing that this chaotic state is the greatest for creativity. You can solve problems. It's very healthy. And I kind of wanted to focus on how this entire scene is, I believe it to be extremely destructive, and I see a lot of interest of people wanting to follow this path. They're rolling out the 60s again, and I just, as much as a public service, in order to give people the background and kind of make these connections in one place.
Excellent, and I fully agree with you. And of course, I came out of the whole ethnobotany and theogen field and researched it, wrote books on it for years, and I've also tried just about all of these substances, and not just once, but many times. And in hindsight, having done this show for 8 years now, it was a really big wake-up call, because early on in the beginning of this show, I started out by interviewing 55 of the world's leading psychedelic experts. And what happened was that series of interviews created a fishbowl effect for me, where, halfway, 3/4 of the way through the project, I realized that it was, that things weren't right. And in fact, sitting about 5 feet from me, I have a 1,000-page manuscript that I never published. That's 2 volumes of all of these interviews that I did. And once I got done transcribing the interviews, it was a holy shit moment,
I think you need to drop some acid and clear your mind.
Well, yeah. I mean, that's what James Fadiman and the CIA and all of the others want us to believe. And now we have the latest ayahuasca fever going on right now, and that's a big farce. And I interviewed Marlene de Rios back in 2009, and she died in 2012. And she and I were discussing having her back on, but she was under chemotherapy and suffering a cancer, and she had written me about 8 weeks before she died to tell me that she was going to have to postpone the show. And unfortunately, she died before she could come on again. But she was the original promoter, along with CIA agent William Burroughs, of ayahuasca or yage. It's unfortunate that I didn't get to have her back on to ask her more pointed questions after I began to figure out what was really going on. And of course, she was an anthropologist at Cal State Fullerton, and she was also a associate professor of psychology or psychiatry, I forget which, at UC Irvine. And so, she was part of this weaponized anthropology. She did the original studies with the natives in Iquitos, Peru, and she had lived and worked with them for many years, and then she was the one who did the original papers and promotion of ayahuasca outside of Burroughs. So there's a whole nother story to be told there. Oh, and then and just real quickly to summarize this, is the Santo Daime and UDV, Una de Vegetal churches were both created out of the rubber industry. And so they have their creation of these guys that were working for the rubber industry. They create a religion, and then these religions are existent today and spread around the world. And of course, now they have legal status in the United States, etc.
Yeah, and I've discussed before my Santo Daime experiences a little bit on here, and I would have to say that was one of the most absolutely disturbing, terrifying experiences of my life. And I'm not somebody who's inexperienced in those realms. So what I saw, what was happening was, massive amounts of possession by various entities, people going insane. I know personally of several people who have done that, and absolutely they're in mental hospitals now, and even close friends of mine. So I do feel that I think that I feel kind of passionately about this, and probably people that knew me in the past would be a little bit surprised. But, even if you want to try something once in a controlled environment, perhaps you may gain some insight. But as we go through this, one thing about LSD, and I'm going a little bit out of order here, but let me just read a quote. is that LSD, there's a lot of drugs, right? You can take cocaine many times. You can take cocaine once, you're going to be fine, right? You can drink, you can overdose on alcohol. You can smoke too much pot and fall asleep. But LSD is one of those drugs, you can take it once and live with those effects the rest of your life. And I think that there's far more substantial portions of the population that have experienced that. And I just want to read a quote. There's a lot of studies, hallucinogen persisting perception disorder. And this is an affliction that affects many, many people. A lot of times it's misdiagnosed. There's a visual snow phenomena. There's a lot of other things. But just a brief thing from this study. A 48-year-old man presented with unusual and distressing visual experiences with varying degrees of severity for over 20 years. Some of these included the following: red objects having a green shimmer around them like 3D glasses, altered sense for distance estimations, people's faces seeming to change shape when looked at, alteration of one's own reflection, anything pattern appearing to move all the time, words moving about while reading, things appearing to be multi-layered, bright lights throwing up shadows, vehicles appearing to stretch as they drive past, flying birds looking like animation and difficulty in focusing. When present, his symptoms interfered markedly with his functioning. For example, he could not cross the road, could not read, and how to dim his lights. He struggled with knowing which visual perceptions were real and which were not. The patients felt his visual experiences were related to his past LSD use 25 years ago. He felt that the drug had put him in a coma and he was dreaming all of this. And it goes on to describe him wanting to inflict violence on his family to prove he was real. This guy ended up obviously in a mental hospital, his entire life destroyed from taking LSD a few times. And I could go through 50, 100 other cases like this. And
yeah,
this is
and well, Hans, people like you and I who've done these things, and I've done LSD quite a lot, and I would consider myself lucky in hindsight, you know. And, you know, people will attack me. Oh, well, Jan Irvin, he's never done mushrooms or LSD. That's complete nonsense. I've done these things hundreds of times, folks, and it's not something I'm proud of, you know. And I've written books on it, you know, and I was just mentioning that 2-volume series I did of the 55 of the world's leading psychedelic experts. This is the unpublished series right here, 1,000 pages, folks. You know, of all of the work and research, all of the people that I interviewed on this stuff, it's all right here, transcripted, ready to go to print, and not.
Yeah. And hey, maybe you should maybe you should do it. But, you know, as we'll get into this, you know, this is not something that is so innocuous, right? And one thing to talk about is a hagiography, right? Which means biography of saints, right? The way that the 60s is portrayed, the way that the past is presented to us, and the way that it's very hard to ferret out a lot of this information in terms of how the knowledge is hidden and also how it's spun, right? And a big thing about this is whether it's Ken Kesey, whether it's the Grateful Dead, whether it's whoever, this idea of living the American dream, of pushing boundaries, of undertaking a great adventure, of going into these new territories. And this is sold to people with the idea that it's dangerous. So, you know, you're catching so many young people that want to...
Not dangerous, isn't that what you mean?
No, I mean, the element of danger is also implicit there in certain parts of the narrative, but a good kind of danger, pushing the boundaries, exploring, you know, being like an astronaut, climbing the mountain, being like the founding fathers. And that's part of it. But the real dangers are not expressed.
Well, they're called psychonauts, et cetera, too, you know, using terms like this. Oh, you're not a psychonaut, right?
Yeah, and there's... when we listen to these Owsley interview clips a little bit later on, you find this disdain for people that lost their minds and basically saying they just weren't strong enough. They weren't man enough to survive the acid test. They couldn't hang, you know. Well, as we get into that, you look at that environment. I mean, I could, if you want to talk about a living hell on earth of extreme damage to your entire nervous system, on a massive level. That's what I would posit the acid
Well,
test.
and let's segue from there for a moment into back to ayahuasca, because it's very common for a lot of these ayahuasca brews to contain scopolamine from the datura plant, and that completely scrambles your brain. Scopolamine in its concentrated form, talk about hypersuggestogens. I mean, wow, this is a substance that if somebody gave you pure scopolamine, they could pull up a truck in front of your house, Hans, and tell you to unload all of your furniture out of your house into the truck. You would do it for them, and they would drive off. And then 2 days later, you would come to, not recalling any of it. But your neighbors would think it was all legit because they saw you carrying out all of your own furniture.
Yeah, and I would like to call people's attention, and I'll send you some links for this. There are a lot of cases of people talking about taking LSD, blacking out, right? And then they end up beating up the police, setting things on fire. One guy describes his girlfriend stripped naked and climbed in a tree, said she was a cat. People wake up in jail, and they're blacking out on LSD and not remembering. So there's a chance that the LSD is being cut with something that causes these people to black out.
Well, the question would be what, because it's such a small thing. It's possible there's so many different lysergamides, et cetera, that they don't talk about. And what was LSD? LSD was like Lyserga 35 or something like that. Let me see.
It's 25.
Or LSD 25. So that means it was the 25th in that series of discoveries. So, there's all of these different incapacitating compounds, BZ, Datura, LSD, and then there's the amides, and then the amides, there's who knows how many of these are active, but the idea that they only discovered LSD being active is completely nonsense. There's several of these that were active. Several of them are, or at least one, ergometrine, is deadly. And then there's several lysergamides that you can't get any data on at all. And what are they hiding there? But in my brain database, I've tried to map out a lot of these different lysergamides, and it's taken, quite a bit of effort to even begin to grasp what they've really got there.
Yeah, and Datura in India, right? There's something called bhang, which is made from the cannabis, and this can be laced with Datura. And there's many cases. One example is I won't mention his name, but he was one of the best living tabla players. And he was dosed with Datura, and he lost his mind. It was by someone who was jealous of his talent. And this happens a lot in India. Datura is also very much associated with dark occult practices. And as we'll see, I think that is an underlying current that people who don't go below the surface, right? That don't go below the happy-go-lucky, flower power, peace and love. I would posit that dark side was present right at the very beginning, and in fact was coupled with this entire peace and love hippie movement right from the onset. And that dark side was just, laying in wait, for that to be activated. But I just, wanted to mention, though, that again, this LSD and these hallucinogens being rolled out again for the younger generation, just like it was in the 1990s. You had the Grateful Dead with their comeback album, and you have all these frat kids, sorority sisters, throwing on their tie-dyes and being part of the Dead. Well, who knows what was being done.
I went to like 8 or 9 Dead shows myself back in the day, and I can't even remember half of them. I was so freaking loaded.
It's probably good. But, talking about the hagiography, I wanted just read some of these quotes about the acid tests, which, Jan, if you just want to say something about the acid tests real quick in case people aren't familiar with them.
Well, the acid tests were tests that the merry pranksters put on, and, they were promoted as, can you pass the acid test and this sort of stuff as a oh, I don't know, a challenge to see how brave you were. But really, they were CIA, SRI sponsored studies to see how LSD would affect people on a mass scale when when distributed. So yeah, that was all done by the Merry Pranksters and Ken Kesey and the Grateful Dead and Stanley Bear Owsley, etc. So electric acid Kool-Aid tests, and then they even use the Illuminati eye in their thing. Can you pass the acid test? So they're posing it as a challenge with the warlocks there, and November 27th, Santa Cruz at 7 p.m. But yeah, I mean, it appears that the L.A. Watts acid tests were done. I've heard rumors, and it's very possible that they were done next to a brothel in Watts, so that they had the same thing going on that they did up in San Francisco with the Operation Midnight Climax going on up there.
Well, yeah, and what's interesting is that the acid test, it's kind of hard to get actual data, right? Even though the pranksters filmed everything, there's only one film clip I was able to find. There is one, on Daily Motion, but let me just read just a couple quotes here in terms of how the acid tests are presented sort of in the mainstream interpretation. And just mention one person, Ken Babbs, who was Kesey's right-hand man. He described the acid, the Merry Pranksters about peace, love, goodwill, happiness, positive vibes. It was a lot of fun. It was breaking out of our shells. It was adventure. It was joy. It was freedom. It was what America's all about, hence the drapery and American flags. So let me just read a quote here from Tom Wolfe. We'll talk about it a bit more later. Quote, "The acid tests were the epoch of the psychedelic style and practically everything that has gone into it. I don't mean merely that the pranksters did it first, rather that it all came straight out of the acid tests in a direct line leading to the Trips Festival of January 1966. That brought the whole thing full out into the open. Mixed media entertainment. This came straight out of the acid tests, combination of lighted movie projections, strobes, tapes, rock and roll, black light, acid rock, the sound of the Beatles' Sgt. Pepper album, and the high vibrato electronic sounds of Jefferson Airplane, the Mothers of Invention, and many other groups. The mothers of it all were the Grateful Dead at the acid tests. The Dead were the audio counterpart of Roy Seaburn's light projections. Owsley was responsible for some of this indirectly. Owsley had snapped back from his great freak out, which I'll talk about later, and started pouring money into the Grateful Dead and thereby the tests. Maybe he figured out the tests were the waves of the future, whether he had freaked out or not. Maybe he thought acid rock was the sound of the future, and he would become a kind of Brian Epstein for the Grateful Dead. I don't know. In any case, he started buying the Dead equipment, such as no rock and roll band has ever had before, the Beatles included. All manners of tuners, amplifiers, receivers, loudspeakers, microphones, carriages, tapes, theater horns, booms, lights, turntables, instruments, muters, servile messiochronics, whatever was on the market. The sound went down through so many microphones and hooked through so many mixers and variable lag and blew up in so many amplifiers and whirled around in so many speakers and fed back down so many microphones, it came on like a chemical refinery. That's Tom Wolfe from the electric Kool-Aid acid test. So that sounds pretty fun, nice experience. But one thing to note about the acid test, just say that this was done in 1964. They did their great journey across the country. Tom Wolfe did a mainstream, highly praised, extremely popular book published in 1968 that caused many people to become interested in this lifestyle and psychedelics, and in fact still does. Right? Many college kids, even high school kids, read that book and they say,
yeah,
hey.
and the nonsense Carlos Castaneda stuff too.
Yeah. So I'll just another quote, just a quote here, and this is interesting. Never trust a prankster. It was that way because you could never really trust any of us. Rather than have to explain something like why we ate all the food in Gordon Lish's refrigerator and left no note or explanation, you could just say, never trust a prankster. It was another case of the pranksters meeting rational expectations of morality, of controlled behavior with a logic. For Ken Babbs, the reason you should never trust a prankster is the same reason you shouldn't expect perfection from non-pranksters. People are human. Okay, that's from Lee Quanstrom, the book On the Bus. But basically, okay, so already, Ken Babbs, again, saying how peace and love. In fact, that's the majority of the material you'll get on this, on the pranksters. Peace, love, good times, these wacky characters living on the fringes. Let me just continue. Another quote, the use of LSD had given the pranksters a feeling that they were acquiring new powers and that together they could form a group mind. The appearance of Owsley on the scene was fortuitous because it gave Kesey a virtually unlimited supply of LSD and enabled him to bring this new consciousness to many more people. In December 1965, Kesey decided to further his mission of altered consciousness, going public with a series of acid tests. Mountain Girl outlined it. Quote, we had this idea to give LSD free to everyone at events we were going to set up. It grew out of a party idea, a Saturday night party. Every Saturday night you have a colossal party and you invite everybody and everybody you can think of to invite them and turn them all on and have a good time and show weird movies, light shows, or anything else we could think of to do at that time. The early acid tests were at Kesey's place. It was a total experience. Okay, anyway, so that's an example. Again, acid test, good time, really fun. It wasn't just a gig. This is Jerry Garcia. It wasn't just a gig. It was the acid test. Anything was okay. It was far out, beautiful magic. We had no reputation and no one was paying to see us or anything like that. We weren't the headliners. The events was. Anything that happened was part of it. There was always the option not to play. It's freedom. Okay, blah, blah, blah. It's Jerry. It's freedom. And this is Phil Lesh, and we'll get to Owsley about this a bit later, this is really creepy actually. But anyways, there was a lot of straight ahead telepathy that went on during those sessions. We learned during those sessions to trust our intuitions because that was all about we had to go on. When you learn to trust your intuitions, you're going to be given to try things, to experiment, and you're going to be given to try extemporaneous assaults of one sort or another. We were participants and so were they. We were just making waves as big and bold as we could, and they rippled against each other, and what kinds of shimmers they all caused. For my friends and I, these drugs, pot, acid, the other entheogens, were seen as tools to enhance awareness, to expand our horizons, to access other levels of the mind, to manifest the numinous and the sacred, tools that had been in use for thousands of years by shamans, by oracles, and the ancient mystery schools, by all whose mission was to penetrate beyond the veil of illusion. In short, these experiences were not embarked upon as an escape from reality. They were explorations into the super real, voyages designed to bring a larger sense of reality back into human consciousness, which had become irredeemably bogged down in the material world. That's Mr. Phil Lesh in his book, Searching for the Sound. Now, notice there, we are the electric shamans, right? We are bringing together, we are on the cusp, the evolutionary threshold of human consciousness, of humankind, and that's what the acid tests were about. So I want everyone to kind of keep that in mind as we go further into this. I don't know if you want to chime in.
Not off the top of my head. Go ahead.
Okay, and I just wanted to give just a taste of because I think the media perceptual layers about particular things are very, very telling, right? You look at that and you look at things and why are these things being presented in this way? I think today we'll pull that back. Just another little quick quote from Phil Lesh, and think if this sounds like fun. Let's walk, or should I say dance, crawl through a typical acid test layout. Entering, we find ourselves in darkness, relieved only by the blinding flashes of strobe lights, carefully timed to be out of sync with one another and the music. What seems like several hundred people are variously milling about, dancing strenuously, or puddled in the corners, against the walls and on the floor, all clad in colorful and exotic clothing. My favorite costume has always been prankster Paul Foster's outfit at Palo Alto, swathed in bandages like a mummy, wearing a World War II vintage gas mask and a sign around his neck that read, "I'm the Pepsi generation and you're a pimply freak." That sounds a bit odd. We'll hear a bit from Paul Foster later, who basically became absolutely crispy. But look at that. Just a few things I want to call attention to. You have strobe lights, right, which induce lots and lots of effects on the brain. There was an incident where there was a Pokemon episode that had these particular flashing lights at frequencies that caused an epidemic of seizures throughout Japan. And so this is interesting thing so that's an example. Just watching a TV show caused many children to be hospitalized. That's from a Pokemon, which we'll get to later. But notice that we've talked in our previous episodes about synchronization. In this case, you're looking at multiple out of sync temporal loops, right? So you have flashing lights asynchronized with the music. So we'll get into later the kind of effect that had. But look at this guy's costume. Imagine you've taken a massive dose of LSD. You're in this environment, and this guy is swathed in a mummy, wearing a World War II gas mask. And the sign says, "I'm the Pepsi generation, and you're a pimply freak." Especially if you're a young kid who, whatever. A little bit more from Phil on this. Okay, quote, "Several projection screens are showing vastly different sequences of images, film clips, or full-color quasi-protoplasmic blobs moving in time or not to the music. The music itself is manifesting not from silence, but from a bed of ambient sound created by the aforementioned Mobius loops of microphones and speakers, and is enhanced by interjection of what we call prankster music, loud, incomprehensible, jagged, and not exactly lyrical, punctuated by shrieks, moans, expostulations, cries, murmurs, and laughter emitted spontaneously by the assembled freaks." And then he goes on to talk about how it's this ecstasy, religious ecstasy, this spiritual state of communion, blah, blah, blah. But, Jan, does that sound like you've done psychedelics, does that sound like an environment you'd want to be?
No, well, and it sounds like intentional discordianism, creating discord, and who was behind the creation of Discord but Kerry Thornley and Robert Anton Wilson. So it's all of these different layers of just, if you're just doing acid tests and seeing how the public does, you'd go in with a bottle of acid and give it out. Maybe you'd have a live band playing and, just people having fun. But what is being described there is the flashing lights, this discordant music, freak sounds. What they're doing is driving bad trips, essentially. And then on top of that, seeing, what the effect is between the lights and the sounds and the drugs on the participants of the acid test. And then, after they did this freak show, they've gone around for the last 50 years pretending that it was some heroic thing that they've done, and people have eaten it up.
Yeah, and Tom Wolfe was criticized in several reviews, and in my own opinion as well, for painting Ken Kesey as a Christ-like figure. So he painted Ken Kesey in such a light that he was this, all-American boy who was, following, again, this adventurous path and became this shining example, this beacon of light, this guru, again, a Christ-like figure. And let me just, a couple more brief quotes on the sort of positive side of the acid test. Mr. Ram Dass, we all know Ram Dass.
I think you're pronouncing that incorrectly, but go ahead.
Okay, I got you. Yeah. Mr. Richard Alpert, one of the
Richard Dick Alpert, Ram Dass, yes.
The author of Be Here Now, one of the coffee table books for all the hippie generations. You know, you've probably all seen that.
Somebody gave me a copy of it years ago, and it was just like, okay, you know, and now I can see, of course, what they were doing, and it's just amusing crap from the intelligence community in Harvard, but anyway.
So here's Ram Dass about these wonderful acid tests. Quote, "My general feeling is that the acid tests were extraordinary. I felt they were magic. In many ways, I saw it as a religious ritual. I called them scary because there were clearly bad trips going on within the frameworks of the tests. They seemed to me not to be bad trips in the sense that they were lethal, but bad in the sense that people were getting more than they bargained for. Those of us from Millbrook saw the acid tests as religious rituals and sacramental events. Going into the acid tests, we still thought that acid had that quality about it that made us feel like religious seekers or research explorers. But the acid tests were different in that they had incredibly strong sensual immediacy. They turned people inside out into the moment in a way that they felt extremely alive. These events were crowded, wild, and confusing. They almost demanded surrender. For some, the surrender was great, but others didn't like that feeling of having no safe ground." So Mr. Hindu mysticism, Mr. Peace and Love, Ram Dass, who, is known for giving all these lectures worldwide, Seva Foundation, is describing this as a wonderful, positive, religious, spiritual ritual. One quote from Mr. Tim Leary, quote, "I don't think that the acid test made the federal government move any quicker towards a clampdown on acid. What the pranksters were doing was an authentic pagan religious ceremony that initiated thousands of people. By the way, I never heard of any casualties from it. There were over 3,000 people in one of those warehouses with electric Kool-Aid, and I never heard of any casualty rate. Out of those acid tests, we have a living, growing flower known as the Grateful Dead. Several 100,000 people go to see them each year. It is almost like the bus. They just keep traveling." Okay, so that's Tim Leary.
I was just looking for a quote that I think it was Steve Outram sent me yesterday, stating that Joanna Harcourt Smith, whom I've been trying to get on the show to talk about her work with the CIA and Timothy Leary, but they don't like to just come out and admit that they're CIA agents, unfortunately, and she runs the Future Primitive podcast, and she's the ex-wife of the apparent cult leader whom lives in Spain now, John Lash, whom I mistakenly interviewed many years ago. But apparently what it looks like is that Leary and Joanna were hanging out upstairs and, just watching the whole show going on, and they weren't really participating in all of this stuff like is claimed. In other words, Leary apparently tripped a few times and rarely, but it's the stories are told like he was tripping all the time, but apparently he was locked up upstairs with Joanna,
watching everything on the light and sound system. Yeah, no, and this is, and I guess that as I'm doing kind of a slow lead up here, but I'll say one thing. I listened to some of the acid test music last night. I, completely sober besides some coffee, I felt physically ill and incredibly disturbed just listening to it. It had some weird voices, crystalline growth structure in your brain, weird kind of delay effects, parallel, tape loops going on, disturbing screams and yells, things inducing paranoia. And then I would have to say pretty third rate, sorry for all you deadheads out there, but, knockoff third-rate blues R&B stuff with some psychedelic noodling. I mean, if you're, that's just the music or some of the sounds they were doing. I mean, and it's, like I said, it's weird considering they filmed everything. It's so hard to get the actual footage of this stuff. But anyways,
and why would they be filming? Why would a bunch of hippies be filming it all? And where, back then a camera to carry around was no small, inexpensive thing to get a hold of.
Yeah, and there's a documentary, I think, on the bus I kind of forced myself to sit through. Real positive, and, Kesey is just this really nice guy, but they have this, just think about it, 1964, out of the blue, they've got this Dayglow bus, like out of nowhere, and they're driving cross country with a direct connection to the Beat Generation with Neil Cassidy at the wheel. When we get to the next episode, we have them saying that Neil Cassidy was their father figure. With a breakdown of the family system, Neil Cassidy was the larger paterfamilias for the entire movement. Neil Cassidy, of course, was the Dean Moriarty in seminal On the Road, which was such a countercultural icon. But I mean, this guy was, in the S&M, he was totally wired on speed all the time. He was pretty much a wacko. He was, but anyways. But these things, I just, as we get into this, I just to show what people are talking about this and how it's being sold. Adventure, excitement, spiritual journey, and the implicit thing, if you can't handle it, you're not a hero. You couldn't survive the hero's journey. You weren't tough enough. You couldn't pass the test. Now, here's another quote here. Now we're going to get a little bit more of the other side, slowly. Quote, I asked Kesey whether he was referring to the Menlo Park experiments, which he was, and whether he knew that the CIA was behind them. No, he said. Allen Ginsberg used to tell him this, but nobody believed him until the Freedom of Information Act unlocked the evidence. How did Ginsberg know? I asked. Ginsberg was one of those little ferrets, Kesey said, and he had lots of other little ferrets under him, and they ferret out a lot of this stuff.
A ferret that has lots of little, if that doesn't sound like a cell with cells underneath it, I don't know what does.
Yeah. Now listen to this. When the proof arrived, Kesey had said, of course. That's how you know that there were angels and other beings, because irony suggests a humor from above. His mind caterwauls ahead. Quote, and when you see something like the Grateful Dead spreading acid around that the CIA has brought into the country, which is and then a bracket from the author, which isn't exactly what happened, but Kesey's not a stickler for details, you can feel the irony and you get a little giggle out of it yourself. And Hunter S. Thompson appreciates the irony too. He says, quote, you betcha. When I marvel over the unexpected creativity of government military research, quote, they created me for one thing, and Kesey in the acid test, and Kesey for the acid test. So that's from, I'll give you all the citations. But notice that the little ferrets underneath him, and there's angels. Oh, it's okay, man. I never believed that. Buddy old Mr. Allen, Mr.
Well, it was funny, too. One thing that you mentioned earlier, I forget you were reading one of these quotes, and, we're going to be given all of this stuff, and we have to try it, obviously, they're getting these drugs, etc., from someplace. I mean, a bunch of hippies on the road in a bus just don't get experimental drugs handed to them unless they have connections into military intelligence.
Yeah. And in case there's some naysayers listening to this, I hope there are, I'll just draw your attention to a Time magazine article, which says the basically LSD trade dying out after the Grateful Dead broke up. So, people deny, the Grateful Dead were not an LSD distribution network. Well, there's Time magazine, and just kind of talking about it kind of a tongue-in-cheek way, that basically they're, the Grateful Dead. And then after Fish broke up, then pretty much you have a massive direct, like off the cliff drop of LSD showing up around the country. So we'll get back to that later. But let me just get a few other things of that. And, and Ken Kesey, CIA bringing LSD into the country. Okay, Ken, well, you're getting it from Owsley, dude. So, you know what I mean? Like right there, he's, he knew where he was getting his LSD. But anyways, and this is this is a very interesting quote. And I have to track down and clarify the source, but I do think this is a correct quote from Blair Jackson's book, MG, and I have some quotes from, I think I know who this is, but on the Muir Beach acid test. Quote, "The delay machine was one of the most important things there because there was this short lag on your voice. And it was just long enough to be really uncomfortable, and it would really fuck you up. It was exactly the length of time it would take you to form a thought. So just as your next thought was formed, you heard your voice speaking the previous thought. It was really hard to make progress through that. I had a strobe light that my brother Donald, who had hung with the pranksters a bit, had borrowed from the Stanford Research Institute. And that was really great. It had this huge calibrated dial and was worth thousands of dollars." Okay, so right there. And in fact, what he's talking about is used as types of weaponry, crowd control weaponry used to disrupt people. Because what happens is you get this echo on your voice and you get this delay. It becomes impossible to speak. There's a timing you do that where it's related, to how exactly what he said, how long it takes you to form a thought. So you can use this on people. It's been done, with either to shut down, like public events and all these kind of things where you're trying to talk and you literally can't talk because of the echo. When you hear your voice come back to you, you can no longer think. It shuts down your ability to speak and think. And in mentioning that they got this really cool strobe machine they borrowed from the Stanford Research Institute. And then,
and surely Stanford would just want to hand over this multi-$1,000 piece of strobe lighting equipment to a bunch of hippies for no reason, unless, as we've shown repeatedly, Stanford SRI was part of the MKUltra project,
Yeah.
And then there's that recording of Ken Kesey, where he's, with the tape recorder that Joe and I did an episode on, and he's saying that, he's on acid, and then he gets the idea just sort of magically to combine strobe lights with music, and I mean, it's like, come on. So I'll have to insert that clip here, too.
How are you feeling right now? You seem to feel there's still some effect of the drug?
Oh, yeah. Oh, I told you about the strobe light. It was so great.
What was the effect of the strobe light?
It was like a magnetic force would be up because everything that went to it was concentric going into where the strobe light. Bats and hen eggs and everything cascading into the strobe light as it blinked. This guy next door was playing his band rock and roll, and this would have an effect of very discordant in color.
Yeah, these magic ideas, just like Owsley describes coming up with the Grateful Dead logo with its 13-point lightning bolt. Very interesting. He said he saw a road sign and developed a sign just to put on the Dead's gear so no one would walk away with it. He saw this road sign and he decided to create this 13-point lightning bolt, which we'll look at a little bit more of that esoteric stuff. But let me just throw in this thing here. This is from a recent article. And just for the audience, there's so much material as you start to go into this that it's very easy to lose sight of the forest. But let me just give you a contemporary example. This is a guy who's named Batcho, Stephen Batcho, who's a DARPA whistleblower. And he describes, quote, "I seem to have stumbled across an advanced technology that I would classify as synthetic telepathy. It clearly uses the cellular towers to transmit illegal signals. It sounds unbelievable, but it is actual technology being used on the civilians of the U.S. My basic research does indicate that such technology can exist and dates back to the V2K P300 mindwave technology of the 70s. This does appear to be a much more advanced version that allows open communication of the human mind to mind bridges," end quote. According to Batcho, the internal radio frequency, RF, generated by the electrical impulses of the human brain is 450 megahertz, which is why ham radio operators are not allowed to transmit between 400 and 700 megahertz, although he says that cell phone towers transmitted 853 megahertz. He's talking about calling for the installation of filters. But this idea of synthetic telepathy, group mind, this is also something you find in literature about the pranksters, and we'll get into more detail about that.
And you know what's interesting, Hans, to interject there, is people actually think of this idea of the group mind as a good thing. But I mean, what better way to promote group think? You know, total social control. You have the hive mind.
Yeah, and that's actually, one of, I don't know if your listeners have done psychedelics, but there are times, I've known people and you experience like where you can communicate with someone telepathically. You feel
sure. I've felt that, and then when you come down, you question if it was real. But I've had those experiences.
And then you have, like, for example, like the Funkadelic album cover. It shows all their minds melded together, right? And so that was a big part of the psychedelic music, was designed for these types of altered states of consciousness, and one of them being this synthetic telepathy, and also one of the agendas of the Merry Pranksters was known as creating a state of intersubjectivity, right? So they all could basically hear everyone else's thoughts. And anyways, so that's just a little bit of a surface take on that, but I just wanted to step back here and just talk a little bit about, which you've done a lot, but MK Ultra, Project Bluebird, etc., and just give some of the what I think are kind of telling quotes from internal documents related to this project, and let's just see if this makes any sense. Okay, so Project Bluebird. June 11th document describes as, quote, the program as, quote, physiological research leading to a better understanding of the constituent factors in human behavior. Physiological and pharmacological research leading to a better understanding of the action or effectiveness of various agents used in connection with the efforts to control human behavior. All right, so here's another quote, July 1952, from a scientist, quote, our own work contains the strong suggestion that LSD will produce mass hysteria, unaccountable laughter, anxiety, etc. While our studies so far have been carried out in isolated individuals, one at a time, it is well known that hysteria is compounded when several vulnerable individuals are together. The lysergic acid derivative can produce a temporary state of severe imbalance, hysteria, insanity. Conceivably, this might be an unusually merciful agent of warfare, temporarily nullifying the individual's effectiveness, but not permanently damaging him. So, a little bit of the background. And I don't know if you've seen that YouTube clip. There's a test. I think it's psychotic induction of psychotic response in individual through LSD. There's a little YouTube clip on one of these experiments from archival footage.
This is a general feeling when you look around yourself. Is that correct?
Yeah.
Now you're getting emotional again. Now look at the picture now. Look at the picture. Look at it, and just concentrate on the eyebrows. That's where you were. Just look at it. You said it takes about 5 minutes, isn't it? Correct?
5 minutes.
Oh, come on, now concentrate on it. Do you have the feeling of reality when you look at this?
So, I mean, as we've covered, but that to me sounds a bit like the Merry Pranksters, doesn't it? To a certain extent.
Yeah.
There's, I don't want to go too much into this, but the symptoms, well, okay, they're looking at how basically they did lots and lots of studies, as you've covered, on various programs, strategic medical significance of lysergic acid, diethymatic, and other things. And another thing about the program, 75 report by the CIA's Inspector General summed it up. Quote, the program had explored avenues of control of human behavior, including such subject as radiation, electroshock, psychology, psychiatry, sociology, and anthropology, harassment, substances and paramilitary devices and methods. The Technical Services Division of the CIA doctrine was described as being to the effect that testing of materials under accepted scientific procedure does not disclose the full pattern of reactions that may occur in operational situations, leading to the TSD, that's Technical Service Divisions, initiating a program in 1955 of covert testing of materials on unwitting U.S. citizens. In a number of instances, the test subjects became ill for hours on days, including hospitalization, in one case at least, and it talks about ethics, etc. Okay, so it's a little bit of a backdrop, kind of pre-MK Ultra research. But at the same time, there is a lot of research, right? You've probably seen that says LSD does not cause any harm to the individual's brain, right?
Well, sure, and I've interviewed Stanislav Grof and Dave Nichols and all of these guys, In fact, I've got recordings of them saying it doesn't do any of this stuff.
Yeah, I mean, just some stats, 1.8 psychotic episodes per 1,000 patients, 1.2 attempted suicides, and 0.04% completed suicide per 1,000. Only 0.4, and another 1969 study, basically they're saying that it's a very, very small percentage of people that have adverse reactions. Hence
Steve Outram was saying to me recently that the burner community has a far higher suicide rate.
Yeah, well, and one thing to say about the psychedelic experience, even if you have a great psychedelic experience, right? Even if you go and cross through the doors of perception, you follow into the state of cosmic consciousness, experiencing oneness with all reality, and become a living God.
Well, don't oversell it there. Go ahead.
The next day you wake up, you have to go back to your job. You have to go to class. You have to go to high school. And what this does is create a split. It can create a permanent state of dissociated experience. It can create a state of meaninglessness in life.
Absolutely.
It can create this idea that either you want to keep doing it or your entire life, in a sense, it creates this almost like a dual or a split personality, and your intellect becomes caught in the middle. And so, or at the same time, if you continue to do LSD, you can end up as just completely burned out. On the other hand, this can lead into trying to chase that dragon. You can go into hard drugs, you can go to heroin, cocaine, whatever. But I think fundamentally it can create an internal cleavage, right? You have this part of your mind that sort of experienced this ecstatic state, and you have your daily life, and there's not really a bridge to cross them. And so that, I think, is one of the effects that maybe is not discussed that much, but that, I think ultimately that can create.
And they tell us that that's a good thing. Oh, well, your regular, real reality life just sucks, so you need to be high and live in this dream state all the time. That the dream state is more real than reality. But is it? And we can maybe learn some things. Like I said, I've done these substances hundreds of times, and I think if I had done them 10 or 20 times, I would have gotten as much or more out of them than doing them more than that, and I don't, I can't say, oh, well, I've done it hundreds of times and therefore you shouldn't, because then I'm a hypocrite. But, I just recommend people know what you're getting into and know how serious these things are and how you can screw up your, create a psychological division or a discord between, wanting to live at all. I know a lot of people who have been burners, etc., who are manic depressive, who can't get along in daily life and things like that. And the MK Ultra has sold all of this as a good thing. They took the name psychotomimetic out, which is to mimic psychosis, and they renamed it to psychedelic and entheogen, to make it sound like the psychotic break was a good, positive thing. Oh, well, this psychotic break, this is what real spirituality is. See, and they rename the substances. That's what my article in Theogens, What's in a Name, goes into, is laying all of this out, exactly who marketed it, what terms they came up with. There were 2 teams that did all of this, and it was all done intentionally to get people to accept the psychotic break as a spiritual experience and something that they wanted to go through. And you even have Tim Leary and Oscar Janiger at Janiger's house in that 79 reunion video bragging that the whole thing was a California invention. And before the 1950s, nobody at Harvard, when they were doing all these studies and experiments, when they were named psychotomimetic and schizophrenogen, nobody there had any of these experiences. As soon as they renamed them to something that sounded positive and spiritual, that's when the first religious type experiences began to happen.
Of course, it was part of the coolness of the Los Angeles cell, whatever you want to call it, that they kept a, you kept a...
Well, you might not call it a cell, let's call it a cluster.
Our undercover agents in Los Angeles were very cool about, and yet they did more in a very laid-back way. And it's never been as public as some of the other, the buses running around the country.
Yeah, and then Zinberg says that the visionary experience and all the things he was doing at Harvard and the others, his residents and the rest that he was giving LSD to, they never had a visionary or an ecstatic or mystic experience, but the whole thing was a California invention, he said. And he said, and the only time it ever happened was when you crossed the Colorado River.
Yeah, and the other aspect is that, when you live in a culture that's controlled, where avenues are there of discord, a big part of that is creating the sense that your life is not what it should be, right? Your sense that the nuclear family is meaningless, that, and a lot of things may indeed be meaningless, but you're exacerbating that sense and selling this as you're becoming part of this new wave, again, of evolution of humanity. And at the same time, you're, in a sense, I would describe it as a great analogy is, for example, all these teenage girls now that are massively engaged in sex, right? 14, 15 years old, orgies, whatever you want to call it. There's and by the time they're 19 or 20, they can never have a normal relationship. They've already blown through all of that. That entire important part of human experience is absolutely tainted. Now, maybe they can recover from that. But in the sexual sense, you look at that as the cognitive sense. And so the benefits of these substances are such that I would question, given the risk factor, if you can take mushrooms, probably not the same thing. If you can take something once.
I disagree. I mean, look at, I've been working on a paper on the history of mushrooms as they came, out of Mexico, and looking at all the primary citations, Hans. And Gordon Wasson cherry-picked a handful of stories and put them together to create this religion, but the mushrooms in Aztec culture were used for human sacrifice and suicide. So why the hell isn't that talked about? Maria Sabina very clearly states that before Gordon Wasson came along, no one did them to find God or to have a religious experience, that they were solely for curing the sicknesses and diseases that their people suffered from. And so, Wasson goes in, he cherry picks and omits anything from the Florentine Codex and from Diego Duran and Modellini, etc., that doesn't jive. But when you go in and actually look at all the primary citations, the Aztecs knew what this stuff was used for. Yeah. The same damn thing the CIA was using it for, pretty much.
Yeah.
Let me just say really quickly on one other point that you made, because all of this, the family being worthless, etc., obviously the antithesis of this is true, because this is why the CIA, this is why the AJC, this is why SRI and these psychopathic organizations working for the intelligence community want to break and destroy the family. They see the family as a threat. And if they can break the family, if they can break where life even comes from, then they have total control. They want incubator babies out of test tubes and everything. Parents don't exist. Socialist government, creates all life, controls all life. You put certain chemicals in the test tube to create alpha, beta, delta, epsilon, etc., to make them as dumb or as smart as you want. This is what we see with vaccines, etc., going on. It's the Western analog of the Hindu caste system. And it's all being done intentionally, but they are intentionally targeting the family because they see the family as the largest threat. And never mind that all of these morons came out of families. Maybe some of them had a bad family, or some of them, ate too much soy growing up, so they turned out, homosexual or whatever. So they want to attack the family. But, all of these people can't even grasp where life comes from. So they want to own life so that they can elevate themselves to God, because they can't handle the idea that they didn't create the breath of life.
Exactly. And in fact, as we go through this and get deeper, we'll see that this idea of the alchemical transformation, which is connected with this idea of manipulating nature, of gaining control of nature, of ascending to the level of God, to being able to create life, is a big component, not only of the Grateful Dead, but of this whole process.
Well, of your Ray Kurzweils and the rest of the nuttos out there,
Yeah, and the singularity and all this stuff. This is something that is related to this negation of life itself. But notice that throughout the movement, you have these father figures. You have Jerry Garcia. He serves as a father figure. You have Ken Kesey. He was a father figure, and he was the leader, an older guy who was a leader. You have Neil Cassidy, as a father figure, et cetera, et cetera. So you have these. So even though people have left their families behind, they've escaped from the beaver cleaver reality into the freedom of cosmic exploration, they still have these father figures, and they still are
sure. Well, what they do is they take the typical nuclear extended family, they break that apart, they create a tribe, and they'll put false heroes in charge of these tribes, and they're based around these commune ideas and Marxism. So I mean, basically they're all parading Karl Marx around as daddy.
Yeah, and that's one of those things where I used to be very interested in communist ideas or Marxism, because on the surface it sounds like a great thing. Let's have equality. Let's all work together. Let's do this. But you find even Karl Marx and all these other people. There is a path you're being led on, right? Even though there may be some short-term things that you might do to affect the monetary or social order. In fact, what you're doing is deploying another form of weaponized social control. And I think that's a great segue into lovely Palo Alto, California, which is I would say this is where the 60s counterculture was born. Not San Francisco, but lovely Palo Alto. You want to say anything about Palo Alto?
It's just the Palo Alto Veterans Hospital is there. Let's see. We have the Medical Research Institute. Stanford University is there. Syntex Research Institute. Veterans Administration Hospital. You got Ian McKay, Mae Brussel. Even Shirley Temple was out of Palo Alto apparently. But I mean, it's there's definitely a lot going on. You had the Grateful Dead there. You had Ken Kesey. You had the whole mess of Stanford people right there.
Yeah, and I mean, even right now, there's there's an article which I'll just send you a link to that just has a recent CIA startup is decided to locate CIA-backed startup that's taking over Palo Alto. That's from 2016, January 1st, CNBC. So Palo Alto is also home of the Stanford Research Institute. And with Stanford Research Institute, we tie into some of the concluding material that we looked at the FM radio about the Aquarian conspiracy, all these other things. So Stanford SRI, this was a kind of a very important developmental center. And so just coinciding with some of those CIA programs that I mentioned, you have Gerald Hurd, one of, connected with Aldous Huxley, one of the earlier kind of progenitors of LSD, showing up, giving a Sequoia seminar, kind of starting this movement of LSD therapy, and dosing Willis Harman, who at that time was working as a corporate executive, ends up, being deeply involved with all these various other projects. And at the same time, in San Jose, this is where Mr. Ken Kesey attends graduate school on a Woodrow Wilson Fellowship in creative writing, and begins to take LSD. And this is one of those kind of mythological, exciting moments in history, right? This is a epochal, sometimes.
Yeah,
sorry.
well, all of these guys have their official bullshit story. Gordon Wasson and his walk in the woods with Valentina, which is really based off of Genesis in the Bible, and Tim Leary, getting he was obviously approached while he was at Harvard by Humphrey Osmond and Aldous Huxley, etc. But it's just like this serendipity nonsense that we see throughout Dave McGowan, that Dave McGowan exposes in his book, Weird Scenes Inside the Canyon, where every time some strange event happens, it's, and serendipitously, all of these people just happened to be there, and we formed the Grateful Dead that day, and then the next day we woke up, and there were all of these instruments and equipment just sitting on our front door, Yeah.
Well, that's one of the stories of how the Grateful Dead, I think that's Ken Babbs, says this, is that they were doing an acid test, and they had all their own band equipment set up. And this is what he says. And they were jamming and stuff, taking acid, and suddenly these guys just showed up and started playing. And it was the Grateful Dead. Wow, they just walked in the house and just started jamming on the instruments we had set up. And that's exactly what he says.
It's just amazing.
But Ken Kesey, of course, well known as the author of One Who Flew Over the Cuckoo's Nest. And so he was, all-American boy, charismatic, athletic, clean cut. You want to talk about the archetypal ideal CIA recruit. There it is. I've certainly seen, I guess, sometimes I regret not getting a job. I'd probably be pretty rich right now if I had gone to that side. But he seems like kind of the archetypal guy that they would want to recruit for the CIA. And then both he and his friend, who became the ringleader of the pranksters, got this Woodrow Wilson Creative Writing Fellowship in 1958, studied under Wallace Stenger, which I need to look him up. And I'll send you this link for the Ken Kesey archive at UCLA. And it said, at Stanford, Ken Kesey volunteered to take part in a CIA finance study named Project MKUltra at the Menlo Park Veterans Hospital on the effects of psychoactive drugs, particularly LSD, psilocybin, mescaline, and DMT. So right there, what I think is quite interesting is that this is UCLA. Usually they're going to cite sources. You can't just throw something up there on their official, documentary and website saying it was MKUltra he was a part of. And then it said he continued with his own experimentation. His role as a medical guinea pig inspired him to write One Who Flew Over the Cuckoo's Nest. And let's just take a brief aside. We go back, we talked about before the poetry of madness, right? So what's One Who Flew Over the Cuckoo's Nest? We've all seen that movie, Jack Nicholson with that really cool hat he's wearing and the big Indian chief. Well, what's that about? That's about acceptance. Insanity is sanity, right? That's kind of promoting this idea that the whole world is a mental hospital.
And then, you have the Indian, as Joe is broken down, walking off at the end, going back into the neo-feudalist teepee society, and this is the direction that they want us to go.
Yeah. And so what's interesting is that, and I'll just be the first to admit, given all the material, I didn't go as much into Mr. Kesey I would have liked to. But Ken Kesey, 1964, so they decide to take this mythic trip, right? He recruits all these people, forms the Merry Pranksters. This I need to check into, but I've seen on a website with a lot of other incorrect information, but saying the Merry Pranksters was a group of medieval Satanists. If anyone has an actual reference for that, I'd like to see it. That may be apocryphal. But anyways, he formed this wonderful group. They paint the again, out of the blue. Where did this psychedelic art? It was like suddenly out of nowhere. This is the first actual hippie movement. You have the Beat Generation still relatively dressing well, beret, goatee, whatever, still sort of, you see a lot of pictures of Kerouac. He's wearing a suit, even clean cut, so even from the older counterculture, you see this break, right? And out of nowhere, again, let's say, 1964, this is before everything. They take this road trip across the country. They have over 30 hours of footage, and they film it, with, riding with a big thing on top of the bus. They're all draped in American flags, and this is a great American dream, celebrating it. He comes back, and then he starts the acid tests. And again, we can look into the linkage to the Kennedy assassination. This is brought up by a lot of as we get into the interviews with the dead, they bring this up. Kennedy assassination was when everyone was looking for something else. So this is, you look at the first break, if you're looking at the induction of psychosis on a social scale, the first thing is the initial trauma, which certainly can be described as the JFK assassination. But so Ken Kesey again sets up these wonderful acid tests, which again, if you're taking LSD and they were taking massive quantities of extremely pure LSD, would you want to be in one of these environments? I mean, just think of the effect that had on your nervous system, on your brain, on your physiology. That is, okay, there's something to be said, I guess, for surviving things. There's a practice in Tibetan Buddhism known as Chode, where you stay on a cremation ground and try to, face all your darkest fears. This is where you're putting your brain into a meat grinder and sitting there and just grinding it for years. And then is that, okay, if I'm a man, is it manly if I run out in front of a semi? Am I a man because I can play chicken with a semi? No, I'm a fucking idiot. And that's, I think that the mythology of the acid test is central to this entire mythos. But let's, so we'll move a little bit more here. And then again, we're looking at a creation of a mythos. So we're creating a mythical narrative, even the bus itself further, right? Get on the bus. The Grateful Dead themselves kept that journey of the bus. So this bus could be described as an archetypal event. You know what I mean? Almost if you were going to write a movie about it, make a movie, write a script, you would assemble this cast of characters, right? And then with this magical direct link to Jack Kerouac, with, Dean Moriarty, who Jack Kerouac in a passage on the road describes as this, this firework going off where everyone says, "Ah," so they just, you live fast, die young. You explode in this, efflorescent burst of light, and you've really lived or whatever. So Dean Moriarty, or Neil Cassidy again, represented this direct link with the 50s beat culture, with the folk culture, with East and West Coast, because and with also this mythos of the American counterculture, which was being developed. Now go ahead, look at the bus. Hopefully you can show some clips of that bus, and just think about these guys suddenly deciding to do this out of nowhere. You look at the footage on the bus. Neil Cassidy is an absolute maniac. He's just a nut job. I'm sorry to say, he's a freak. And then people describe, some of the pranksters describe being on the bus as kind of like a living hell. And some people that lost their minds on LSD were just dropped off the side of the road. They just dropped them off in some small town, nuts. I'll just leave them there. And they just move on because you couldn't hang. So anyway, he set up these acid tests, and so the acid tests, which are I think, so central because, just going back to one of those quotes I read, this was the genesis of the entire 1960s rock culture, the style of dress, the day glow, the flashing lights, the rock concerts, the use of rock concerts, right? Use of psychedelic rock, and we talked about before, you kind of have rock and roll kind of being dead. Why didn't people listen to classical music? Why don't you take classical music and go sit on a mountainside? I mean, some people are doing that, but this association with psychedelic rock, but again, an entire uniform, an entire ideology, and an entire, I would describe as a cosmology. And part of this cosmology, again, is alive today, right? This is what we're trying to push up against. And I think most people just take this as a matter of course. I don't know if you want to chime in on that at all.
No, well, I agree with what you just said. I forget which part it was, but in the Music, Mind Control, and Psychobiology series, we covered how it's all the uniform and all of this stuff is being manufactured, created for them. So, people should really watch that and as a sort of prerequisite to this, because we cover so much ground there. But this is really just bringing it all full circle.
Yeah, and again, everything is taking place in Palo Alto, right? So we have these. I'm going to play some quotes now from some of the actual participants there. Talking about this, but basically the Grateful Dead started in Palo Alto, home of the Stanford Research Institute, home of all of these experimentations, home of these MK Ultra projects, right? That's where the Grateful Dead started, not San Francisco. The first name of the group were the Zodiacs, and then they became the Warlocks. So right there, we see this also occult dimension to their music, right? Supposedly they changed their name because there was another band called the Warlocks. But anyways.
Yeah. It was Gary Snyder and these guys who promoted the whole, Gary Snyder, former professor at UC Davis, who promoted the whole Summer of Love thing. And that was something that was decided on by him and Tim Leary, Allen Ginsberg, and Alan Watts at Alan Watts's houseboat.
Yeah.
So, so before then, this was clearly the Summer of Love was a thing that they created and targeted onto San Francisco. And we've covered before that they actually targeted many large cities around the country simultaneously. But, the Palo Alto team was essentially the core, CIA and SRI researchers essentially that were promoting the core ideas.
Yeah, and I don't know if I read that quote, but they're talking about the need for testing LSD on different types of populations, on large populations, to experiment with that. So let me just play some interview recordings. This is Hank Harrison, who I'll get into in a second here, but this is Hank Harrison. These are some things talking about the music, the spiritual vibe, and also about the weird synchronicity of everyone being in Palo Alto. So here's Hank Harrison on the Grateful Dead's music.
But it can be so subtle. Here we are.
Edit out my part.
No, it was supernatural space being, wasn't that what Mahler, Ives, Scriabin, Obach,
Henry Cusack?
whoever, you know more about.
Sure, well, like the idea of the great books of the Western world presents these monuments of literature as being part of a great conversation, like an ongoing.
Okay, so I just paused that. That was actually Tom Constantine, one of the original members of the Dead. The first, part of the clip, he talks about music being written on the Akashic record.
Well, and he talks about the great books of the Western world. That's the whole series of all of the great classic philosophy books.
Yeah, and then he's talking about classical composers, the great classical composers. So how do you jive this with the Grateful Dead unless they're placing the Grateful Dead on that same plane? Let me just keep going here.
Well, if you consider the order that the great books of the Western world are in, and you're supposed to follow this order or whatever when you study them, you see them as systems of social control throughout the ages. So then, in that sense, the Grateful Dead would fit there.
Yeah. So let me play. This was another quote. These are all basically taken around early late 60s, early 70s from various participants.
Now, the synchronicity of this whole scene is almost divine. I mean, it's the probability of that kind of synchronicity happening that often with those kinds of people can only be explained by one hypothesis, that there were only about 1,000 of us.
God, I feel so important.
There were only about 1,000 people around here, you know, that were really turned on an inner level, you know. There was a lot of turned on people, but I mean, like people that were really doing the number, you know. And all those people that it turns out, what I'm saying is they all got the same flash simultaneously. Like a great electric cloud came down on a certain number of people and lifted off and sort of put a mark on so many people.
A certain number of people working for the CIA.
You know. Probably the Kennedy assassination is a big factor in it.
Yeah.
Next, we have...
He said...
Well, and get this. So, who was Kennedy's arch nemesis? He was a guy by the name of Aldous Huxley. What day did Aldous Huxley die? Well, the same day as the JFK assassination. Who headed MK Ultra? Who was one of the key architects? Aldous Huxley. So Aldous Huxley kicks the bucket, supposedly, from the research that I've done, it looks like Laura Huxley murdered him. And I lay that out in Spies in Academic Clothing. But this, we have Kennedy's arch nemesis, who is murdered by Laura on a massive dose of LSD and other drugs on the same day that Kennedy is assassinated. And then and this is all launched from there. And then it appears that Wasson, and which I revealed in the first article in the series, Gordon Wasson, the man, the legend, the myth, that it appears that Wasson was directly tied to the Kennedy assassination.
Yeah, and again, this is Mike. Unfortunately, I got to get his name. He's the same guy who talks about borrowing the delay device from SRI. Now I'm going to play another clip. This is Paul Foster, the same guy that was described at the acid test wearing the gas mask and the mummy suit. He's pretty fried at this point when this interview was taken, but hopefully you guys can understand it. And then I'll explain what he says.
Also got interested in this girl, B,
Right.
who was a friend of a cousin of a guy who worked with me. I'm a programmer now.
Yeah.
I'm a computer programmer.
Don't you do it now?
This is the beginning of '64, let's say.
What are you doing right now?
I'm working as a common laborer with...
He said, he's talking about how he got into the Merry Pranksters, describing that time and said, I'm a programmer now. I'm a computer programmer. Okay. That's, he was just, again, he's a little bit fried, so it's kind of hard to follow his narrative. And even the interviewer thinks he's talking about what he's doing now. And he says, he's a laborer. He just works some odd job, right? Again, this is Paul Foster, one of the founding Merry Pranksters. He's describing his development, introduced to these people, how he got into the organization. It says, I'm John Lilly, programming and reprogramming the human biocomputer. Sometimes you got to catch these little slips. Here's another quote, another clip from Paul Foster describing the weird, how everything was taking place in Palo Alto. So here's Paul Foster again.
We got to the off stage, huh? Okay, anyway, this night, this we have to come up to. These guys are trying to make a commercial thing go. Okay, there's mainly two groups. There's the San Jose group and there's the Palo Alto group. Now, there's interchange between them, but there's mainly those two. The San Jose group included Pigpen only because he could get it. Only because he needed the dough.
Yeah.
Okay? I paid him $15 a night. And it was groovy. I was getting a good deal. I was getting a very good deal. This chick, the she would take care of getting me on stage, you see. And it was cool. And then he'd play his set, which was when people had calmed down a bit, okay?
Yeah.
And it was groovy, and we put the lights low, because he didn't like to get up on the stage.
He's straight shot, right?
He really did. He is.
Yeah.
He's better at it though. See, it's taken him 3 years to do a solo now. He gets up, does his little solo numbers. Yeah. Like he used to.
I'll have to transcribe that. That's one guy who probably did take acid a lot, and you can see he's pretty much totally crispy. But he's basically saying there's these two groups: the Palo Alto and the San Jose wing. Both San Jose is also there as two groups. This is Ken Kesey, right? They're having these merry pranksters, these two cells where the LSD is coming from and starting this social movement. Like I said, that guy is definitely, but it's interesting. He's describing, again, he got involved. I'm a programmer. I'm a computer programmer now. Anyways, here's another quote here. It's from Pigpen on the Foundation of the Dead.
Rather than making a documented history of each of our progressions.
Yeah.
It's not just the Grateful Dead. It's not just the Warlocks. It's not just the Zodiacs.
Yeah.
It's not just Mother McCree's. It's the whole thing on the way it came together.
Right.
It's a lot smoother and has a lot less hard edges.
I'm hoping that it will blend in all together like a big balloon or bubble of some kind. Eventually.
Again, these are his little clips, but he's saying the Grateful Dead, it's not just the Dead, it's not the Zodiacs, the Warlocks, and he's trying to say that everything just came together. It's very smooth how everything came together. It's the whole scene being created, right? And this is Pigpen from the Grateful Dead. Describing that, again, in a way that all these different groups, it's not some, again, we're looking at this description of synchronicity, of all these people showing up at the same time, of all these things happening, right? And this interconnection of all these layers. So, and then let me play one last one from, actually, I'll skip that because it's, some of these things, these are from the Hank Harrison interviews he did for his book on the Dead, and I can just go into Hank Harrison. The Owsley, now, but just comparing these guys, when you hear from Garcia and Owsley, these guys are very sharp, highly intelligent, highly articulate, know exactly what they're doing, are familiar with multiple branches of science. They are not idiots. They are not, fried out people. But I don't know if you want to chime in there, and then I'll move into Hank Harrison.
No, go ahead.
Okay. So you're familiar with who Hank Harrison is by any chance?
Yeah, he's the manager of the Grateful Dead.
Yeah, manager of the Warlocks, right? And so Hank Harrison was a student, a disciple of Saul Alinsky. Okay? Saul Alinsky, the writer, he wrote the book Rules for Radicals, which is a manual for creating revolutionary movements within society. Hillary Clinton wrote a thesis on Saul Alinsky, Rules for Radicals, and the Alinsky method, you could say, has been utilized in a variety of modern contexts, including all the color revolutions, Black Lives Matter, possibly a lot of this social engineering. Saul Alinsky was sort of the godfather of that, of course, aligned with the far left. But basically, Hank Harrison said he was sent there to work for Saul Alinsky to do this, some kind of social activism work for Saul Alinsky. And then he started managing the Grateful Dead. And again, Hank Harrison is one of those kind of foggy figures in the background, not so well known, but yet very much connected with all these people. And I think sometimes these background figures.
Yeah, wasn't he also Courtney Love's dad?
Yes, he is Courtney Love's dad. In fact, has a book he wrote about how she killed Kurt Cobain. He describes how his daughter was like part of some super hi-fi commune, flying around with private jets, and he didn't speak to her, and whatever. So I haven't followed that too much. That's his later work. But yeah, he's the father of Courtney Love. He's also the author of a book called The Dead, which was disowned by the Grateful Dead themselves because, unfortunately, Hank Harrison didn't realize that certain things you're not supposed to talk about in public. So he kind of, and these some of these these are clips of interviews he did when he was working on the book in the early 70s. Some of the audio clips I played are from him during his writing. And let me just read the again, Rules for Radicals. Hillary Clinton, a great radical, a great person for overthrowing governments. And there's a lot of research on Saul Alinsky and employment of Saul Alinsky method. I won't go into that in too great detail. But the dedication of his book, Rules for Radicals. Let me just read this. This is from Saul Alinsky himself. Least we forget at least an over-the-shoulder acknowledgement to the very first radical. From all our legends, mythology, and history, and who is to know where mythology leaves off and history begins, or which is which? The first radical known to man who rebelled against the establishment and did it effectively. Did it so effectively that he won his own kingdom, Lucifer. So he's dedicated the book Rules for Radicals to Lucifer. And again, I won't go into detail about Rules for Radicals, but it's very much a manual for how to create subversive movements, how to infiltrate society, how to create, again, revolutionary destruction of things, but, working, as basically a very advanced and very functional strategy for doing that. So if you look at the 60s counterculture as following the model of this great architect of social movements, of revolutionary and counter-revolutionary movements, again, whose work is central to the modern topology, geostrategic, geopolitical topology of the last 30 years, the manager of the Warlocks is Hank Harrison. I wanted one interesting little thing about Hank Harrison being involved with the Grateful Dead, with the Warlocks, and then he started running an anti-LSD group. So he was running a group that was against LSD a few years later. And then during the interviews done in 1970, he's talking about taking mushrooms with Phil Lesh, and he said even when Phil Lesh was tripping, he still wouldn't allow him to record an interview. But so he's back to doing hallucinogens again, but during the height of the psychedelic era, he's sort of like a just say no type of character that is actually going against the against the Grateful Dead.
Well, that reminds me of the official story is that Leary was fighting against LSD's outlaw. And then you go into the 1966 congressional hearings, and Leary's there at the hearings recommending LSD's outlaw. But of course, I had to go to the congressional records at the University of Riverside to pull them. But every single book that I read from all of these guys omitted all of the parts from Leary's testimony where he was recommending LSD's outlaw. And of course, kids don't rebel with legal substances, and Leary's work would have been worthless if they didn't, outlaw LSD. And then the day that LSD was outlawed, what was it, 666 or something like that, 6666, something like that, was the official kickoff of the Summer of Love.
And same day that this Church of Satan was founded.
Oh, is it?
Yeah. And there's some interesting ties to that too. But I just sent you a link. This is a documentary done on his Hank Harrison's work against LSD. So if you could just play just a little bit of this. And sure. I think this is kind of like a just say no type of thing, right? Where you're going against it, but you're also kind of creating an interest in it. So go ahead and run a little bit of that.
California and Berkeley. Hank Harrison directs the unique LSD rescue mission in San Francisco.
Kids with the new quest going on, coming into the Haight-Ashbury, are actually seeking an adventure. So, and LSD is part of this adventure for them. The tragedy is that it's not always a pleasant adventure, and it has, now that we've looked back on some of our statistics, we've seen people spend many months in mental institutions because of it. Now that's not, of course, the most common. The most common kind of experience that we find is the drunken experience. It's a trip. It feels good, but it goes away. And the promise that they've heard about LSD does not come true.
You know, I kind of stress this point probably so much that it's like banging people on the head with it, but look at what's promoted. Look at what gets media attention and what doesn't. Look at what is allowed into the public eye. Look what comes out into the public eye in a simultaneous manner. And so speaking of that, before I get into a little bit more on Hank Harrison, I wanted to play a nice little clip done around the same time as this anti-LSD video, which I think you should run this in full. And this is a little promo piece on the Grateful Dead that was done, and it's a well-produced thing, and this is done in 1967 when supposedly I would assume they were still pretty much an underground, you know, outlaw band, you know, and the Haight-Ashbury was still kind of obscure to people. And so this is quite interesting just to look at this clip and how the Grateful Dead is being introduced to people in the world. So just go ahead and run this whole thing. It's about 6 minutes long.
In Haight-Ashbury, doors are for letting people in, not keeping them out. In an apartment like this, the doors swing open often. Here live the Grateful Dead, a popular rock group whose bachelor home life ranges from the bizarre to the beatific. But more often than not, the huge flat pulses to an ordinary beat.
The Grateful Dead are roar rockers. They're the rockers that roar, the rock and rolls that blast out sound. Beautiful freak out zap style. There's a real grace inherent within the ability to make in a room a kind of continuous, simultaneous altar of four walls, to present paintings and wood and precious objects and stones and dripping candles and reflections of light in new ways from new sources on a multiplicity of the awarenesses of what's going on, to be able to move as a group from room to room and present yourself in a new situation, to conceive of like human pleasure as a dramatic situation, to be able to be comic about it, to be able to be beautiful about it, to be able to wear a funny hat, to be able to wear your hair to your shoulders, to take like Pigpen for a name and be proud of it, to be able to smile at being called a hippie, to live in a universe of your own creation.
Our dining room has a table in it that has an enormous black crater on the top where there was a recent fire. We all walked out of the house leaving all the candles burning.
Yeah. Is that what happened?
Mm-hmm.
And then the wax caught fire?
The candles burned down to a glass and busted the glass, and the candle fell over.
Yeah, our equipment manager came back to the house before we did and found a fire burning on the table, called us up, told us about the fire, and then split.
He didn't tell us on the phone that he put it out. He was splitting, he was getting out of the house.
This is not a fad. This is going back to the 9,000 years of tradition preceding the last 50 years. The last 50 years of mechanization and of Bauhaus architecture and the rigidity of the square blocks of the city and of concrete and steel and girders. The morals of this community are not the kind of morals that the police departments attribute to it. There's a sexual freedom. The idea of sexual restrictions is really passé down there, but it's passé on Madison Avenue and passé on New Montgomery Street too. It's just that there's not the hypocrisy going on. The straight people really need what's happening here. They need to come in and see. This is an experiment that's not going to come to them. They have to come in here and look at it. The creatures in a beautiful experiment with X-ray crystallography, diffraction, electron microscopy are not going to crawl out and look at you.
Like any neighborhood, the Haight-Ashbury district has a seamier side that we've not dwelled upon. There is here, to be sure, a widespread traffic in illegal hallucinatory drugs, many of them placed in the hands of youngsters and others with tragic results. Here also in this neighborhood are persons who are mean, selfish, lazy, decadent. There are also criminals in this neighborhood. There are sexual excesses in this neighborhood. And there is unhappiness in this neighborhood. But are there any more of these things here than in many other parts of the city? Possibly, but probably not. The degree is not important. One does not have to condone everything in Haight-Ashbury to know that it exists, and no harm can come from trying to understand what is happening.
Imagine the Haight-Ashbury district as a lion peering through a tambourine with intense, dark, golden eyes, with a cross hanging down from the tambourine, and mushrooms and roses growing below it, and the lion peering through the tambourine with intense, dark, golden eyes, and think of it as being an image, disappearing, peering, coming back, retracting itself, manifesting itself, being beautiful, and it is all perfect, this is really it, and it is all perfect, this is really it, and it is all perfect, this is really it, and it is all perfect, this is really it, and it is all perfect, this is really it, and it is all perfect, this is really it, and it is all perfect, this is really it, and it is all perfect, this is really it.
So if you notice in both of these clips, first of all, you're getting the manager of the Grateful Dead, working again to prevent people from taking LSD. So taking the other side, trying to, in just, kind of like a weird about face, just like Owsley had. And then we see this very highly professional clip on the Grateful Dead when they were basically not known at all to the large public. And you see them in their lifestyle. They're talking in this very sort of psychedelic speak. You have that very strange voiceover at the end. But you can see with this, they are selling the Grateful Dead. They are selling this lifestyle. And if these guys were so underground and so revolutionary, LSD has been made illegal. How do you explain this highly slick television production coming out about, and this is before electric Kool-Aid acid test. So if this was after electric Kool-Aid acid test, it might make sense. But the Grateful Dead, they never were really that popular in terms of album sales during their career. But at this point, they were still pretty obscure. I don't know if you have any thoughts on that. But.
Well, they were the number one concert ticket sales band, for decades. But I don't, the whole Deadhead scene was about getting the live pirate tapes and things like that. So, they were one of the few bands, I think, that allowed people to come in and just record to distribute their mind control that way, right? Rather than through the typical CIA distribution channels that the music industry usually uses.
Yeah. Well, no, I'm just specifically like this video clip from 1967. The Dead were still pretty obscure,
sure.
But they're not even really being introduced as the Dead. They're introduced as this kind of psychedelic household, and this is the new way to go. So I think that's very interesting and very telling because you have the black and the white, right? You have the
sure.
controlled opposition. You have Hank Harrison shifting from one side to the other, doing the anti-LSD stuff after he managed the Warlocks, and then you have the Grateful Dead being promoted in such a way that it's really an advertisement, as well as showcasing the LSD consciousness as this very special realm of the mind where you're in this transcendent state, and it's quite odd. But anyways, I think that again want to underscore the connection of the Warlocks manager with Saul Alinsky, who was, again, this social organization master, and with, and as a seeing that this social movement is being engineered. We have a direct link where the guy said he was there working for Saul Alinsky, Hank Harrison, and then started managing the Warlocks, right? There's also...
I was just going to add, I think it was Joe Atwill who discovered ties between Saul Alinsky and Barack Obama.
Oh, no, Saul Alinsky's shadow is huge, and that's why I'm not even opening that cookie right now. But so now I just wanted to read, this book, The Dead, by Hank Harrison. Let's just look at the cover. This is a volume 1. The whole book's not available online. Actually, it was out of print and sort of semi-suppressed for a while. But let's just look at some of the pictures, and I'm just going to read a few quotes from his book, where basically, again, he crossed the threshold of what you were supposed to talk about. Because even though he's a full-on participant, he loves the movement, he's actually talking about what's only for the, those behind the scenes to know.
Those hanging out at Bohemian Grove on the weekends.
Yeah. Well, and that's actually a certain argument I would give, is that these people, you always wonder if someone's part of this movement, how they can keep their cover for so long. I would
lifetime actors like Wasson, like Leary, like so many of them that we've come across.
Well, I would say on another hand, they're not acting because their actual agenda, which isn't that hidden, especially, let's keep in mind that, when you're on LSD, you get in these kind of mystical cosmic states. They very much were aligned with a deeper occult esoteric agenda, which relates
but don't forget, though, that mysticism is the tool of tyrants. I mean, I always see the promotion of mystical, magical thinking with these types of social control movements.
Well, yeah, but what I'm saying is that what they actually were believing and what they were practicing is not what was being promoted on the surface. I mean, for most people, the Grateful Dead, they're playing this kind of laid-back country rock. They're a bunch of smiley old guys with beards, and you trip out and have a good time and play hacky sack, And so they're really not aware of these deeper layers and deeper levels that they were involved in. And so so we look at Hank Harrison's pictures right here. So the first picture, we see a Moon Unit and the GTOs. It's a very disturbing picture. You see the little child on the ground. You see these two women behind her looking like basically very demonic, with really psychotic looks in their eyes. One of them is holding a baby bottle. And that's one of the pictures in the beginning. Moon Unit and the GTOs. I just find that's a pretty creepy picture. We go forward to the next picture. We see Hank Harrison, the author of the book, at the Presidio gun emplacement. And I think, wasn't that where the Manson family and stuff were getting their weapons and doing weapons training and stuff? I may be wrong on that, but I think the Presidio okay. Anyways, and then we'll look.
Well, the Presidio was obviously a military base as well, up in the Bay Area up until the 90s. So what the hell is he doing on a Presidio gun emplacement?
Yeah, and then look at this picture on page 3, the deadhead. So you see the guy holding a skull up with a weird skull-like face, and that's also sort of letting it go out. And then then we have pictures of the chakras, motorcycle gangs. So let me just read some quotes from Hank Harrison real quick. So the logo used by the Archive Press is an exact copy of an Occidental magical formula cast in a zodiac circle. It is derived in part from the Monas hieroglyphia of John Dee, the Elizabethan magus. The earliest source of the siglet, according to Dee, is a woodcut in handwritten copy of De Naturalium of Isidore of Seville. And then this was taken by the alchemical philosophers to mean that the human beings are an exact depiction of the cosmos, etc. Okay, so basically right there we see this alignment with, I talked before about Sabbateans and all this stuff. You have this, whether or not you choose to believe in the mysticism, there is fact that people on these elite tiers are part of groups that use this for certain reasons, but basically they're aligning themselves with John Dee, not with...
For sure. And of course, John Dee was an agent for the Crown of England and big influence on people like Terence McKenna and, you know, any big agents out there. They have certain heroes like Hassani Sabah, Emanuel Swedenborg, Aleister Crowley, John Dee, etc. These are the typical big heroes of your, of most intelligence agents.
Yep. And then again, remember they're having some of this non-ordinary experience through LSD. So anyways, and then the next is another quote from him. Quote, "I think San Francisco State was the only school in the Bay Area, including Stanford, attempting to humanize its teachings at the same time, and the only one close at hand psychology school, which was actually fun to go to. Most of the graduate students there were somehow attempting to replace Watsonian behaviorism with ethological science. The idea was to supplant Pavlov's dog with Lily's dolphins." Okay, Pavlov's dog, control of society, taking behaviorism to this idea of programming and reprogramming the human biocomputer. Just like Paul Foster let slip. I'm a programmer. I'm a computer programmer. You know, guy behind the scenes in the Merry Prankster.
Sure.
Another quote, "During the 1964 season, the year before the Warlocks were formed, I was recruited by the great Saul Alinsky to help organize shop-ins." And then, you know, he's working with Mike Lowenthal and Jane Chivel. But he's saying right there he's working with Saul Alinsky. And then he sees himself he describes himself as the Jane Goodall of the hippie movement. So he didn't say, not even the Margaret Mead, he didn't say the great sociologist. Jane Goodall studied what? Apes, primates, animals.
Right.
So in the intro, I'm the Jane Goodall of the hippie movement. And then, you know, okay, this is about him studying. "Most importantly, we learned to study our own environment. We learned to study what was going on in our own backyards as a microcosm of the real world," which is Saul Alinsky, right? Starting on the local level, start with the real environment. Don't impose your ideology on the situation. See the situation, integrate yourself, infiltrate internally, not externally. Next quote, "Most of the sexual change was a reaction to generations of puritanical repression. The new sexual dynamic was facilitated by disc jockeys, television, rock and roll, drugs, a new affluence with attendant permissiveness, and a reversion to pagan rituals, although a few of these were really satanic." Then he goes more, you know, I won't go through all these, but basically describing, you know, sex as political liberation, etc. So again, we see, and Hank Harrison, you know, goes into lots of other deeper aspects of that. But basically, we're seeing that, you know, I mean, there's Saul Alinsky, there's Hank Harrison, and the fact that they see themselves as cultural revolutionaries, right? They're following this idea of overthrowing culture, not as an afterthought, but as a direct part of their motive operandi. You know, supplanting with rituals, creating new communities, creating new feudally based systems that derive from the psychotropic research and also derive from the particular dynamics of, you know, the baby boomer generation. And so I don't know if you want to throw anything in there, but I think we'll cut it there unless I think that might take too long if I go into Owsley. So,
all right, well, we can cover Owsley in part 2 maybe, or can we sum it up really quickly or no?
Owsley, I've got a lot of stuff of him talking, and Owsley is I think Owsley is really, we start to get to the meat of really the whole thing.
All right, well, why don't we save that for part 2 and then, take it from there, basically.
Okay.
Does that work for you?
Yeah, that's fine. Yeah.
All right. So, well, Hans, I appreciate the additional research and new vistas of understanding all of this mind control and social control stuff. I mean, it goes back to that famous quote from from Edward Bernays from page 1 of his book Propaganda. And once you begin to see all of this, I was just seeing if I could find it and pull it up here and read it quickly. But this one quote really seems to play out how, and I don't even have it in. I'm just looking for an article where I have it. But it's the page 1 where the public doesn't know the strings that that control the public mind, etc. But clearly, we are getting to the roots of the who and the what and the where and the when to understand why and how they did all of this, all of this social control.
Yeah, no, definitely. And, as, we can conclude our second part, we'll see how this ties into the the direct link with the technology, et cetera, et cetera. And, it's one of those things that, it always, still to me, it's always a bit hard to put my head around the fact that the people are that malevolent, with, again, when you see the acid test with this information and you see what they were doing, and when we listen to Owlsley's description of the acid test, they are absolutely, what this is, we're looking at de-patterning, right?
Yeah.
We're looking at group de-patterning. Look at some of the Ewan Cameron's techniques with strobe lights, with all this stuff. You're looking at de-patterning, reprogramming, and even he's admitting, Hank Harrison is talking about, we went from, Pavlov's dog to Lily's dolphins, and these are both metaphors for Pavlov's dog as a stimulus response. So this is a far more complex level of social control that's much deeper than just simply operant conditioning. And, it's regrettable that, so many people have been, sucked into this, and hopefully, that it will not be rolled out on another generation. Because if you combine,
hopefully we can stop it and expose it enough and spread it far and wide enough to stop these sons of bitches.
Yeah. Yeah. But great, John. Yeah, I just called him John.
What's
it's been
that?
a real pleasure. And I'm one of Ginsburg's little ferrets.
Yeah, well, yeah, great. Well, and I did find that quote here, just to go back to the Bernays point. And I've read this quote many times on the show, but for those of you who don't know it, the conscious and intelligent manipulation of the organized habits and opinions of the masses is an important element in democratic society. Of course, that's mob rule and how the elites run the mob. Those who manipulate this unseen mechanism of society constitute an invisible government in which the true ruling power of which is the true ruling power of our country. We are governed, our minds molded, our tastes formed, our ideas suggested, largely by men we have never heard of. This is the logical result, of course he's using spin here, it's a book on propaganda, of the way in which our democratic society is organized. Vast numbers of human beings must cooperate in this manner if they are to live together as a smoothly functioning society. In almost every act of our daily lives, whether in the sphere of politics or business, in our social conduct or ethical thinking, we are dominated by the relatively small number of persons who understand the mental processes and social patterns of the masses. It is they who pull the wires which control the public mind. And I think that's a good place to wrap it up.
Certainly is. And we'll continue to delve into this a little bit. And, I think it's important a little bit to really, you draw that strong causal connection. You show, a lot of stuff I've done is a bit general. So it's nice just to look at these people. Who were they? And tying this in, with the actual program. So, yeah, and just like everybody, check out my website. It's a little bit better. I redid it. I have some new material up there. I've got 3 albums that are out. Please, you can buy an album. I'd appreciate it. I'll sign it if you want.
Buy your books, etc. All right, Hans.
All right, Jan.
Thank
my
you so
website
much.
is-
Oh, go ahead, Doc. Go ahead.
HansUtter.com is my website.
All right, and we'll have you back on for part 2 of this latest series as soon as we can. Take care.